Hi, welcome to ContainerDays. I'm Rob Richardson. Thanks for joining us for Level Up Your DevOps with GitHub Actions and Kubernetes. Today we're going to build a DevOps pipeline from scratch. Here's the part where I tell you I'm definitely going to post the slides on my site tonight, but in this case there are no slides. This notepad is it. Now we can grab the code that we're about to build from GitHub. Here's our GitHub repository, and it looks like we need to build some code here. Now you can get to this GitHub repository by going to robrich.org, click on presentations, and here's Level Up Your DevOps. You can get to the GitHub repository right away. While you're here on robrich.org, click on About Me, and you can see some of the things that I've done recently. I'm a Cyral developer advocate. If you want to talk about database security, I would love to chat. I'm a Microsoft MVP, a Docker captain, and a friend of Redgate. AZ Give Camp is really fun. AZ Give Camp brings volunteer developers together with charities to build free software. We start building Friday after work. Sunday afternoon, we deliver the completed software back to the charities. If you're in Phoenix, come join us for the next AZ Give Camp. Or if you'd like a Give Camp near you, hit me up on email or Twitter, and let's get a Give Camp in your neighborhood too. Some of the other things that I've done, I do a lot with Docker and Kubernetes training and consulting. If you have that need, hit me up. Some of the other things that I've done, I replied to a .NET Rocks podcast episode. They read my comment on the air, and they sent me a mug. Woo! So there's my claim to fame, my coveted .NET Rocks mug. So let's dig in and build some code to build our DevOps pipeline. .NET New. .NET New allows us to scaffold a website, and we can quickly build a website this way that'll help us to get our content into place. .NET New, MVC, I'll give it a name of Level Up DevOps, and the output folder of dot. Now, if I didn't specify a name, it would use the folder name, in this case demo, and if I didn't specify output, it would create a new folder. Now we've got some content here. Let's open this up in VS Code, and we see that we have a controller, and that controller references views. We've got a view. Here's our home view, and we'll say instead of welcome, welcome to ContainerDays. Now, our next step here is in getting this to a GitHub repository, is to create a .gitignore file. New file, .gitignore, and we're ready to go. Oh, yes, thank you, VS Code. That will create the content that we need to be able to debug our website. Now, here in the gitignore file, our task is to identify all of the built files, all the user-specific files, and ignore them from our repository. So bin and obj, those are our built content, our user content, star.user, star.suo, and the .vs folder. And then we might choose to exclude star.orig or star.logs, any temp files. In this case, we don't have any, so we'll just leave that part out. Our next step is to start building this up into a container. We're going to create a new file. So here's a .dockerignore file. And this .dockerignore file, it has an identical syntax to our gitignore file. So we'll start with our built content, our user-specific content, but we'll also ignore the files that we want to exclude from our production container. So appsettings.development.json, appsettings.development.json, and here inside properties, launch settings.json. Great. Now that dockerignore file is everything that we don't want copied into our container. Now the cool part, because it has the same syntax as a .gitignore, if you don't have a dockerignore but you do have a gitignore, then it'll use that instead. Next, we want to create a Docker file. Docker file. Now it's important that this be named Dockerfile and not Dockerfile.txt. So if you accidentally added the .txt, rename it and just name it Dockerfile. Now I've got the Docker extension into VS Code, so I have this nice whale icon. That's pretty cool. Now, when we're building a Docker file, we'll have four main verbs, from, copy, run, and cmd. If you understand how these four commands work, you can probably read pretty much every Docker file. That's perfect. Next up, let's go look for our base image, our from. Now we'll head here to the to Docker Hub, so hub.docker.com, and we will search for .NET and pull up this repository. Now in this case, this is a meta repository, so it just shows us how to get to other repositories. .NET samples is great for showing various Docker files. .NET runtime deps is what we need to be able to install .NET, but it doesn't have .NET yet. On top of that is .NET runtime that includes the console app details. .NET ASP.NET on top of that includes the details that we need to run a web server. And on top of that is .NET SDK. Now that includes the build tools, so let's pop this open and let's go grab our base image. Here's that base image, and we also have an Alpine variant, so let's use that. So from this -Alpine. Now we need to copy all of our content from the directory where we'll run our Docker build command to the directory inside of our image. Now where is that directory? workdir/src. So it will create this src directory and then cd into it, so we'll copy all of our content into there. Next, we want to run some commands. Now, if we're on a console, we would say .NET restore to restore all of our dependencies. .NET build will build in release mode. .NET test will run all of our tests, and we will say in release mode here so that we don't accidentally get two builds, one in release and one in debug. Next, .NET publish will publish in release mode to the dist folder. And this is not that unlike a right-click publish inside of Visual Studio, but we're doing it here inside of a Docker file in a DevOps pipeline, so we'll know it'll be consistent every time. Now we need to run all of these commands as Docker commands, so let's run this, run this, run this, run this, and now we've got all of our content built. Each of these commands will create a new Docker layer. Next, we want to run this. So let's say .NET level up devops.dll. Now that is in the workdir dist directory. So now we've got a build file ready to go. Let's copy in a few environment variables that we'll need. So here's some content here that will start in production mode, host on port 80, and expose port 80 so that others can connect to it. Now that's great. This Docker file we could use right now, but there's a few things that we could tidy up first. Right now we have our source code and our build tools inside of our production container. If we head back over here to Docker Hub, we can pull up the ASP.NET repository and get at the details for just the hosting. So let's go grab that, and we will set that in place right here from that. And we'll use the Alpine variant again. Now what we've done is we've split our build in half. We're using a multi-stage build. Here is the production runtime server image, and here is the build server image. All of our source code and build tools will end up in this image, and this image won't have any of that. It'll just have our production content that we want to run. So let's switch this over to the app folder, and we will copy the dist folder into place. Now, right now it will go looking for the dist folder here on our local machine. We don't want that. Let's say --from equals build, and we'll tag this one as build, and now it'll pull this dist folder from this build phase. Now we could definitely name this one as prod or whatever, but in this case, let's just leave it blank. So there's one more thing that we can tidy up. Right now we're copying all of our files, and then we're restoring all of our dependencies. That means if I change an HTML file or a CSS file, it will invalidate this layer and re-copy in all of my dependencies. I probably want to flip that. Let's copy in all of our dependencies first, and then copy in all of the other content. Now I still do need to give it the manifest, so let's copy level up devops.csproj into the current folder. And now I can copy my manifest, restore all my packages, copy everything else, then build, test, and publish my content. Perfect. Pardon me. Now I could choose to merge some of these layers by saying and, but in this case, I kind of like that Docker will cache each of these layers. So if my build fails, or if my build succeeds but my tests fail, then it will only invalidate this test layer next time I build. That's really helpful. So we've got our Docker file set. Let's create a readme.md describing our project. Here's that content. And then let's pull in a Kubernetes YAML file. Now I'm going to cheat and just use the content that I grabbed last time. So that'll save us a little bit of typing here. Here's the Kubernetes YAML file that I used last time. So we just need to change the name to level up DevOps. And now we're ready to go. Pardon me. Now this Kubernetes YAML file creates a deployment that will specify, in this case, only one pod. We have a service that will load balance across all of those pods. And we have an ingress controller that will match DNS to the service. Now we do have some replacement expressions in this case, ACR URL, image label, AKS URL. Now we don't want to include these secrets in our source control, so we'll just replace them at build time instead. Okay, so let's come here into source control. We'll look through our files. Are there any built files or any user-specific files? Nope, that looks good. We can also compare our content to compare what we've built with what we had last time. But in this case, all of the files are new, so that's a little bit less helpful. Okay, so create website. We'll commit that. And we'll push it up to GitHub. Git push origin main. Now that we've got our content pushed up to GitHub, then let's take a look at what we've got. Now, I did say that this was pretty much empty, but there is one thing that I did in this repository ahead of time. I went here into settings and I went into secrets and I created some secrets that we can use in our build. Pardon me. I just went into new repository secret. I gave it a name, I gave it a value, and I created it. So now that we've got that content, let's come here into actions and build up a GitHub action. Now this is our build script, so we can start with various templates, a Ruby one, a Rust one, Dino, and we can flip through and find a good template that exactly matches our workflow. Or we can come here in and set up a blank workflow. Let's do that. So I'm going to call this Docker Kubernetes .yaml. And let's say our name is Docker build and push Kubernetes apply. Now we want it to run on push to the main branch, and we'll come back to pull requests. Workflow dispatch is nice because it allows us to manually kick off runs. So let's leave that in place too. Next, let's do some jobs. Now we have a build stage, that's fine. It runs on the latest Ubuntu, that's perfect. And here are the steps that it will do. The first thing it'll do is it will check out our content. And then next we can run some tasks. So let's run this task. We'll do a multi-stage script, Docker build and push, kubectl apply. Great. So here's the steps that we can do. We can say Docker build will build in the current directory, and let's tag this right away as level up DevOps. Now I want to include the registry URL here so that I can push it straight up to GitHub. So let's take a look at how that works. We've already created our secrets, and now we can use those secrets here with this $curly syntax. Okay, so let's say $curly secrets.acr URL, and that will get us our repository URL. Let's also include a label. We'll include github.sha, which is our git hash for the commit that built this. Now that's great. Given a container running in production, we can get back to exactly the version of that was used to build it. Okay, so now that we've got this image created, then let's Docker push this into our container registry. Now to do that, we do need to log in. So let's come here into the marketplace and look for Docker login. This one looks good. We could pull up the full marketplace listing and take a look at how this works, probably get to the GitHub repository, but in this case, we'll just grab the code right here, copy that, and we will set it just above our other task. Let's indent it correctly, and there we go. Now, the first thing we need to do is give it a registry URL. So let's use our secrets.acr URL. We also need to give it a username to our Docker registry. So let's use the secret there, acr username. We also need to give it a password. So let's put in the password here, acr password, and then log out. Now this doesn't log us out at the end of this particular step, but rather at the end of our entire build run. Now, if we're running on a shared host, this is a good idea to clear out all our secrets on our way out. In the case of GitHub, they actually destroy our build machine after it finishes the build, so we're probably safe, but it's good code hygiene nonetheless. Okay, so we're logged into Docker. So now when we Docker push, we'll be able to get that to our container registry. Next up, let's do a kubectl apply-f k8s.yaml. Now, we do need to log into our Kubernetes cluster. So let's come back here to the marketplace and we'll look for Kubernetes set context. This one looks good. Let's grab this one and set it in place. We will need to adjust the YAML indenting so that we're lined up. That looks good. Now, the first step is setting the type of cluster authentication method. We'll use kubeconfig. That looks great. And then let's specify what that kubeconfig is. So $secrets.kubeconfig, and we're ready to go. So we don't need any of the rest of this mechanism for logging in. We'll just delete all that. Okay, so we've got our content in place. Now we do have a few replacement expressions here, AKS URL, ACR URL, image label. Next, let's replace those. I'm going to copy a sed command just because this gets a smidge hairy, and let's take a look through this sed command. We're going to, in this k8s YAML file, we will not back up things. We'll change the string ACR URL to the secret value, AKS URL to the secret value, and image label to the GitHub SHA. Now we do have this in quotes, and we do /g to make sure that if there are spaces in the secrets, that works out well. And we will do it globally for all instances of this across this document, not just the first one. Now, I specifically done this after the Docker push command, because if I was to, for example, do it here, and for example, I came into my Docker ignore file, and I forgot to include the k8s.yaml file here, whoops, then it would get these secrets embedded into the container. I definitely don't want to do that, so I'm going to move this after the Docker push to ensure that my image is far away by the time I start referencing these secrets. Perfect. So we've got our GitHub Actions build script, our DevOps pipeline. Let's come here and we will commit it. GitHub Actions DevOps pipeline. Start commit. Oh, let's actually commit this file. And now it's just a regular file in our repository. It's in the .github/workflows folder. And if we want to get back to that editor, we can pop this file back open and click edit to be able to cruise through the marketplace or to be able to make changes. But since it's just a regular file in our repository, we can also come in here and say Git Pull and pull this down into VS Code. So we've got this file right here, and now we can just change it like we would any other file here in our repository. But because we have a file inside our .github/workflows folder that ends in .yaml, it will kick off a build. So we can see that it kicked off a build, and let's dig in and take a look at how that build is doing. Now it's going to do our Docker login, our Kubernetes set context, run all of our steps in our Docker file, including build, run tests, publish, and then ultimately outside of our Docker file, it will push that content up to our container registry and start that content inside Kubernetes. Looks like we're almost done, and we can see that that build is going to go green. Very nice. Now it does take a minute for the ingress controller to propagate DNS. So to avoid waiting a few minutes, let's use port forwarding. Now we can port forward into a particular pod or into a deployment, or in this case, into a service. Let's do that. So I'll come in here, kubectl port forward to service / level up DevOps, and I will forward port 80 from my local machine to port 80 inside the service. Now, if I have something else running on port 80 on my local machine, I can flip this over to port 8080 on my local machine, forwarding still into port 80 on the service. And now let's go to localhost 8080, and we can see our website running. Welcome to ContainerDays. That was awesome. Now, we did talk a little bit about pull requests. Let's come back to that. Now we have here this build, this Docker Kubernetes build. Let's copy this content, copy that. We'll create a new file here, dockerpr.yaml, and we'll set this in place. Now it's no longer a Docker build and push, but rather Docker build for PRs. Now we want to run on the everything but the main branch. We don't want to kick off both builds here. And we want to do pull requests on branches, all the branches. Now this is great if we have local contributors who are creating new branches and doing pull requests from those branches in the same repository. And this is great if we get pull requests from other users outside this repository, perhaps open source requests. Okay, so what are the steps that we want to do? Well, we don't want to apply it to our production cluster. That would be bad. Because we're not applying it to our Kubernetes cluster, let's not log into our Kubernetes cluster. We also don't need to change the secrets here. Let's delete that line. We also don't want to push our container to the registry because we don't want to accidentally use a pull request container in our live registry. So that means we don't need to log into Docker. And to that end, let's not even name it with our registry URL. Let's just call it level up DevOps -PR. Now we have a pull request build. Now, wouldn't it be cool if we could also put a tag here on our README, kind of giving us a build status? Let's come here into Actions. Let's take a look at our build, and we can go grab the status badge right here. Let's copy this markdown, set it in place here in this README file. There's a good spot. And now we've got a status badge. I'm going to come in here and I'm going to stage all these changes. We have our change where we're now correctly ignoring the Kubernetes YAML file. We've got our README change with the new status badge, and we've got this new PR build. So PR build status badge and ignore kdes.yaml in container. Perfect. Let's push this up. Git push origin main, and that, because we've made changes on our main branch, that will kick off a new build inside of our main branch. Now, last time we went in through this dot to get at the build status. This time, let's click on Actions and wander in. We can see the builds for our PRs. In this case, there aren't any. We can see our builds for this particular build file, or look at all of them. So let's dig into this one, and we'll dig into the build stage. And we can see all the things that it's going to do. Docker login, Kubernetes set context, and then it starts in on our Docker file. So it's going to pull the base image. It's going to restore all our NuGet packages. That worked great. Then it's doing a .NET build. Let's see. Did our build succeeded? Very nice. Let's run all of our tests. All of our tests passed. Now let's do the publish, which will get our content. We'll flip over to the other stage, copy that content into the new image, push that image up to our container registry. We're now outside the Docker file. and then finally apply that into our Kubernetes cluster. Once that works, we've got this post Docker login, so we're logging out of Docker, and our build is green, and we now have a great status badge that shows us the status of our build. Now this was really great. We got to build up a DevOps pipeline starting from scratch, scaffolding out a website, live coding a Docker file, pulling in a Kubernetes YAML file, and building up a DevOps pipeline inside of GitHub Actions that works great for containers, pushing the container up to our Kubernetes cluster. You can fork this repository by just forking this GitHub repo, and you can get to the GitHub repo by going to robrich.org, click on Presentations, and you can grab this source code. I'll meet you at that spot where the conference has designated Q&A, or if you're watching this video later, hit me up on Twitter at rob_rich. Thanks for joining us today at Container Days.